Bloomsbury presents The Hidden Hand by Stella Rimington. Read by Penelope Rawlins. To John, without whose help, when my eyesight worsened, this book might never have been finished. Chapter 1. At 3 in the afternoon, the Boston Public Garden was not crowded, and the bench nearest the Charles Street entrance was unoccupied. It was a good time to meet, Li Min thought as she sat down, holding a copy of the Boston Globe. It was after the lunch hour, when the benches would have been filled with office workers eating their sandwiches, yet too early for the parents and children coming to feed the ducks straight after school. Lost in her thoughts, she only noticed the man when he was seated beside her on the bench. He liked to arrive stealthily, as if from nowhere, but she knew he would have made the journey north from the embassy in Washington, D.C. to see her, and possibly others like her, Li Min wondered. As always, he was dressed very formally, in black suit, white shirt, and shiny city shoes. His face was expressionless as he turned to acknowledge her with a curt nod. She knew nothing about this man, save that he represented her government and that he must be obeyed. Even his full name was a mystery to her. She knew him by one syllable only. Deng. "I have brought my report," she said, to preempt his habit of asking for it as an opener. She picked up the newspaper beside her on the bench, feeling the folder inside as she did so. But for once, Deng did not reach eagerly for the paper. He took it almost casually, saying, "Thank you. I will examine it later. But now, I have something else to discuss with you. A change in your situation." Li Min tried to hide her shock. She was a doctoral student in computer science at Harvard, specializing in artificial intelligence, and she could not think of a better place than this to do her work. After university in Beijing, she had spent 2 years doing a master's at Caltech, where she had improved her English and her technical know-how. Here at Harvard, she had begun to specialize, discovering an aptitude for developing video and audio simulations of individuals which were entirely AI-created, but seemed so real that they would fool all but the most expert. They were known as deepfakes. It was at Harvard that these meetings had begun. With the funding for her studies supplied by her government, Li Min had always known there would be a price to be paid. Until now, her contact with officialdom had consisted of regular meetings with Deng, at which he asked for reports on her work. But today seemed different. "You have been granted a great honor. Oxford University has established, with the approval and cooperation of our government, an Institute of International and Cultural Affairs." He said this mouthful as though he had learned the title by heart. He probably had, thought Li Min, cynically. Deng went on. "The Institute is part of one of the ancient colleges, St. Felix's. It has its own director and trustees, but ultimately it answers to the governing body of the college. These teachers, known as fellows, hire the director and can fire him." He spoke with an authority derived from 20 minutes spent reading St. Felix's website and its entry in Wikipedia. But Li Min was not to know that. He continued, "You will find in the Institute a large group of postgraduate students and some senior visitors. The students work in many different fields and come from all over the world, though, naturally, since much of the funding is Chinese, so are many of the visiting students. The intention is for these groups to mingle and get to know each other." "How interesting," Li Min said, without meaning it. "I am glad you think so, because you have been selected to join the Institute. You will continue your work on artificial intelligence. I am told by my superiors in Beijing that it is most promising, but you will do it as a student at Oxford, not Harvard, and your new address will be St. Felix's College. My understanding is that the 2 universities are equally prestigious." Li Min resisted the desire to argue. On the one occasion she had tried, and that had been over something minor, her attendance at a particular lecture which Deng had requested, he had slapped her down brutally. even threatening to discontinue the Chinese government's underwriting of her course. It seemed wiser now to find out more about what she was being asked to do. Asked? Told, more like it. So she said mildly, "When am I meant to start at Oxford?" Surely they would have to give her another semester at Harvard to complete her dissertation. "The new term begins in 3 weeks. After their Easter holiday." "What?" She could not help herself. Deng ignored her protest. "Mrs. Liu, my assistant, will help you pack up your belongings. Do not worry. If anything gets left behind, we will send it on to you." "But 3 weeks is not enough time for me to do everything I need. To see my advisors and explain to the university that I am leaving." "Who said anything about 3 weeks? Your flight to London leaves Sunday evening, and you will be on it." Chapter 2. "My goodness," said Louise Donovan. "I don't know what you've been doing since I last saw you, and I'm sure you're not going to tell me, but whatever it is, it suits you." "I might say the same about you," replied Manon Tyler, smiling. "You look years younger." They had first met when Manon had visited England on a university exchange course and had been hosted by Louise. That had been 7 years ago, but since then they had kept in touch and seen each other occasionally. Manon had gone on to do graduate work in politics, but soon found the academic life was not for her, too devoid of action, too dry and abstract. She had applied to and been accepted by the CIA and had worked at its headquarters in Langley, Virginia for 3 years before being sent to London. They'd had plenty of time to further their friendship then, since Louise was already living there, working for a political party. She'd become involved with a man who had turned out to be a Russian spy. Following the trauma of that case, Louise had come to Harvard to study for a degree at the Kennedy School of Government. Having accidentally been caught up in that investigation, Manon had discovered she had a taste for field work and action. Her superiors had seen this too, and also noted her ability to keep a cool head in difficult situations. Manon had accordingly been sent on the CIA training course for field officers. She now had a period of leave before her first posting and had come to Boston to visit Louise before going on to spend a few days at her parents' holiday cottage in New Hampshire. They were sitting in the living room of Louise's flat, a pleasant 2-bedroom apartment on a leafy street about a mile from Harvard Square. They chatted on, catching up with each other's news. Louise was enjoying her course, though it was both intensive and hard work, and she said she had little time for social life. "What about you?" she asked Manon. "Is there a man in your life?" "No. There was a super cute guy in my training program, but it didn't happen. He screwed up in exercise and got chucked out. I lost touch with him." "And you?" "No luck. Everyone around here is so young they see me more as a mother hen than as a girlfriend." "There is someone I wanted to mention to you, though. It's a young woman called Li Min. She's a Chinese graduate student. I met her at a party last week, and this is where the mother hen bit comes in. I don't know exactly what she does, but I know it's to do with AI and these deep fakes everyone is talking about. I tried to read about them, but had to give up. It all got way too technical for me. But anyway, Li Min talked cheerfully about her life here and how much she loved Harvard, and then suddenly she became very upset, almost in tears. Why? That's what I wondered. She told me that she's leaving Harvard even though she's only halfway through her degree. Transferring to Oxford, she said. Why is she doing that? I know Oxford is wonderful, but so is Harvard. She knows that, but it's not her choice. Her government is making her move. They pay her fees, so she has to do what she's told. It's a pity, because somebody told me that she's doing very well here. They say she's super bright. Manon said, Does she know why they want her to move? I tried asking, but she was quite cagey about it. I think they're moving her on because of her research. From what she did say, Oxford is in the vanguard of her particular field. I also had the distinct impression that she's being sent to find out about the research already being done there. She called it a fact-finding expedition, but I think she was being sarcastic. I bet she was. Manon thought it sounded more like a polite way of saying to steal secrets for Beijing. Louise laughed. That's more your line than mine, so I thought maybe you'd be interested in meeting her. She calmed down with me eventually, but a mutual friend says she's still terribly troubled. Would you mind if I invited her round? Perhaps for breakfast tomorrow? Okay, said Manon slowly, wondering what Louise might have said to the girl about her houseguest's job. No, she decided. Louise had more sense than to make that kind of mistake. Shall I ask her for 10:30? Yes, said Manon. That's fine. She found she was looking forward to finding out more about this whole business. Louise had gone out and bought croissants and the Sunday papers, and Manon had read more than her fill of the gargantuan Sunday New York Times when the buzzer rang in the apartment. That'll be Li Min, Louise said. I'll sit with you for a minute and then go to my bedroom so you can talk in private. But when she came back a moment later, she was still alone. She held an envelope in her hand and looked puzzled. What's the matter? Asked Manon. I was a friend of Li Min's. She said Li Min had asked her to drop off a note for me. She opened the envelope. Maybe she's ill. I don't think so, said Louise as she scanned the note, and then read aloud. Dear Louise, it was a great pleasure to talk to you. I'm sorry not to be able to join you and your friend this morning, but circumstances make that impossible for me. My apologies. With very good wishes, Li Min. I guess she got cold feet, said Manon. You know, was worried the Chinese authorities would find out she was complaining. I see she's included her address in Oxford. It's St. Felix's College. It's almost as if she's asking us to get in touch, but I won't be going to England anytime soon. I don't suppose I will either, added Manon, but more wistfully. Chapter 3.
You're looking well,
said Ben Fleischman. He was wearing one of his collection of sweaters, each featuring a different animal. Today's had 2 squirrels chasing a walnut, and his jacket was hanging from the back of his chair. He was a roly-poly bear of a man, with a ready smile. Behind his thick-lensed glasses, he had warm and friendly eyes that missed nothing.
Have a seat,
he said, pointing to a chair opposite his desk. As she sat down, Manon took in the smart new quarters of her former boss. He had moved to the central office building of the Langley, Virginia headquarters of the CIA. He had been promoted since she'd seen him last, almost 9 months before, and now occupied a large corner room high up in the main building with a view of the inner courtyard. Ben had encouraged Manon to switch to the agency's operational side, and she suspected his recommendation had been at least partly responsible for her acceptance into the training program. She had promised to come see him when she finished the course, for if she had anything approaching a mentor in the agency, it was Ben. This is quite the palace, she said, half admiringly, half teasing. Fleischman gave a self-deprecating smile. He'd always been appealingly modest, letting his juniors take credit even when, behind the scenes, he had saved the day. He was known within the agency for his affable astuteness and his refusal to play politics.
I had to move,
he said, scratching the bald dome of his head,
because my new duties include fielding courtesy calls from visiting firemen. So, the powers that be decided I had to have enough room to host several people at a time in reasonable comfort.
He shrugged.
At least it frees up the conference room for everybody else,
he added.
But anyway, here you are. It's been a while, Manon. You look great. Not everyone survives the course, and most look absolutely drained when it's finished."
"It was quite challenging," Manon admitted. It had lasted 6 months, the minimum time allotted to training recruits for the operational side of the CIA. The range of topics and activities had been extensive, everything from defensive driving to using the latest cyberspace encryption techniques. There had been plenty of written exercises and nightly homework. Physical fitness had also been part of the regimen. Each day, several hours were spent outside. Manon had always considered herself athletic, a keen skier and a good swimmer, but the past 6 months had set a higher bar than she was used to.
"At least you had the advantage of some real experience. I gather your time in the UK got quite exciting towards the end."
"Yes," she said. It was true she had had a little operational experience under her belt before the course. Unlike the other candidates, she wasn't new to the CIA. In a few months, she would mark her 4th anniversary in the agency.
"What was your favorite part of the program?"
asked Fleischman. Manon didn't hesitate. "The farm," she said simply. Fleischman looked surprised.
"Really? Why was that?"
She thought for a moment. The farm was the nickname for the training facility set in a Virginia military base, 150 miles southeast of Langley. It was used by the CIA almost exclusively to train new members of its clandestine service division. The site combined some of the normal buildings of an army base, though there were more meeting rooms than one might expect of a military setting, a town square, a mock Main Street, storefronts and all, and a replica of a city block where they practiced everything from freeing hostages to hiding themselves from pursuers. Manon said, "What I liked best of all was the work we did on asset handling. You know, gaining assets' confidence, getting the best out of them while reassuring them, that sort of thing." Fleischman nodded at her reply.
"I'm not surprised. That's because you're a people person, Manon. That showed in how you handled your asset over in the UK. That was good work. For a beginner, it was remarkable. People like you when they meet you, and most of the time you seem to like them. That's not something that can be taught. Most operatives are loners, which helps when you're working on your own out in the field. But to recruit a source, you need empathy, and the sensitivity to know when to push and when not to. Loners aren't very good at that. You are."
Manon shuffled her feet slightly. She was never comfortable with outright praise. It was true, however, that the whole business in the UK had given her an injection of confidence that had carried over into her induction into the CIA's operational side. In particular, she now trusted her instincts, even if this sometimes meant bending the rules. To change the subject, she said, "By the way, Ben, there's something I'd like to mention. It's someone I heard about at Harvard 2 weeks ago. A young Chinese woman who was a student there. Was a student, I should say."
"Tell me about her,"
said Fleischman, interest piqued. Manon tried to keep her account of what Louise had learned about Li Min brief and to the point. "I don't even have the name of the Chinese embassy official who seems to have kept tabs on her, but the point is that he demanded that she leave Harvard and move to Oxford with no notice at all." Fleischman said,
"I have a pretty good idea who that is, or else it's one of his minions. Whoever it is, they're probably from China's Ministry of State Security. It used to be their main intelligence agency, was part of the Chinese military, but the MSS has grown tremendously and is especially active overseas."
He turned his head and looked out of the window, thinking hard.
"This isn't the first report of this kind we've had. In fact, there's been a spate of them. Chinese students, usually, though sometimes they are high-tech employees. They get moved around by their government, often out of the blue, and sometimes they're not happy about it. Enough to complain to friends, and one way or another it gets back to us."
"I see. Just like Li Min. So, what do you think is going on?
If I had to guess, I'd say it was part of a campaign. Not espionage, exactly. More like theft. These students are stealing intellectual property and shipping it home. They transfer from one institution to another if it's thought there are better pickings elsewhere or if they have picked somewhere clean.
Well, she was careful about what she told my friend Louise, but I'm pretty sure she's unhappy about her situation.
Would it be difficult for you to see, Lehman? Maybe find out a bit more, like the name of this man at the embassy? Could your friend Louise help you to do that?
Normally, I'd say yes, but Lehman's already left for Oxford. She's now attached to one of the colleges there, St. Felix's. Fleischman nodded and sat thinking for a moment. Then he said,
In that case, I might give Dave Saunders a call over in London.
Manon stood up. I must run. I'm viewing an apartment in Georgetown. Have you heard that my next assignment is here in Langley? He saw her disappointment.
Cheer up,
he said.
I know you might have preferred a foreign posting, but remember, Manon, this is where the real decisions are taken. This is the heart of the business.
He paused for a moment, thinking, and then added slowly,
But things can always change. Don't sign anything on this apartment you were seeing, just for the moment.
I won't. It's just a first viewing. Why was Ben telling her to go slow with this? Did he have something in mind for her? Something elsewhere? Don't get your hopes up, Manon thought. But she couldn't stop them from rising. Chapter 4. Charles Abbott was a Londoner born and bred, though he had spent much of his working life in various embassies abroad. His father had been a GP with a practice in a working-class part of the East End. Charles had met his wife Gillian at Cambridge, where they were both studying modern history. They had married young, but, to their sadness, had no children. When he had joined the Foreign Office, she had accompanied him on all his postings abroad, enjoying the life of a diplomat's wife. He had been expecting that the apex of his career would be a minor ambassadorship. So when a friend had drawn his attention to the advertisement for the Oxford post, he had hesitated, but Gillian had persuaded him to apply. Perhaps his diffidence had helped him with what mattered most, the interview before a board of academics who seemed keen to recruit someone from the outside world. She had been pleased when he had been offered the post at St. Felix's College and the directorship of the Institute, and they had shared their delight in the charming Grace and Favour house on St. Giles that came with the job. Her sudden death had been an appalling shock. Now alone, Abbott realised he had mixed feelings about Oxford, finding the place more urban, busier than Cambridge. Oxford was more bustling, yet also more Gothic, even gloomy. A few months after Gillian's death, he had moved from the pretty house in St. Giles, finding that without the warmth of her presence, the place seemed cold and unwelcoming. He had found a flat further from the centre in a quiet part of the town, which seemed to suit him better. He liked his new position as director of the Institute of International and Cultural Affairs, discovering, after years of frankly middling status in the Foreign Office, that he was now enjoying being in charge. However, he found the formalities of high-table dining irritating and preferred to eat at home, except when someone he found interesting was being entertained, or when he needed to impress potential donors to the Institute. During his years posted abroad, he had attended enough formal dinners to satisfy anyone for a lifetime. On occasion, he invited former colleagues, ambassadors, or experts in various countries to give talks at the Institute. But though it was technically part of the college and Abbott had become one of its fellows on taking up his position, he did not regularly meet the others, except when he dined in or attended meetings of the Fellowship, St. Felix's governing body. The fellow he saw most of was his predecessor, Professor Cole, whom Abbott found cold, superior, and unfriendly. Still grieving deeply for his wife, he found work was the best antidote, and most days his routine was unvaried. He walked from his flat through the parks and then, just off the Broad, straight into the world of the Institute. Then, one evening, as he was collecting mail from his pigeonhole, he noticed an envelope marked Private, addressed simply to the director. He took the mail back to his room and, sitting down with a glass of wine, opened the letter first. Dear Professor Dr. Abbott, it began, which puzzled him, for he was neither. It must be a mistake, he thought, and read on. I write to alert you to a pattern of sabotage and theft which is being perpetrated within the institute of your beloved university. I myself have been watched and surveilled by a fellow student, Mr. Chu, who, for no reason, I discovered in my private room at the Elm examining my belongings. I discovered, too, that Mr. Chu has been in the laboratory in Parks Road, where I have been researching. I am not the only victim of such intrusion, and besides, there are many all too willing to help him gather information, which is then sent back to the government of the People's Republic of China. It is the price exacted by the authorities for paying our study fees and living expenses. Do not blame the others, but also do be aware. I have been conscious of this activity for some time, and have gathered further evidence than my own experiences. You will understand my earlier hesitation to approach you, but I am willing now to disclose the evidence I have collected, though only in confidence and in private. I will be in my room, number 37, all afternoon tomorrow at the Elm, and trust you will be able to join me there. Yours in confidence, Jia Hao. Who the hell was Jia Hao? Abbott called up the database of resident students and scholars. There he was. Jia Hao, a native of Hong Kong, interestingly enough, which meant that, young as he was, 26 according to the file, he would have spent his youthful, possibly formative years in a then democratic enclave, which for a time had retained many of its former allegiances and traditions. And, more interesting still, he was an orphan, raised by Catholic nuns in a children's home funded by the Catholic Church, which explained why the English in his note was so formal. Yet he must have been trusted by the communists to be allowed here as a government-funded research student. Abbott saw from the file notes that Jia Hao was a historian of science and in fact had been doing a PhD at Princeton before coming to Oxford to complete it. This struck Abbott as a strange move, since, in the field of history of science, Oxford was no further advanced than Princeton. But the subject was certainly broad enough to have given him an excuse to spend time in the labs where actual research, much of it highly advanced, was being conducted. The question was whether this was a case of an aggrieved person spouting paranoid accusations, or someone genuinely frightened, threatened, yet willing to spill the beans on what sounded like a foreign government's espionage. Abbott wondered for a moment whether there was anyone or anybody from whom he could seek advice. Professor Cole was the obvious candidate, though Abbott had learned not to expect much help from that quarter. The man resented his arrival. There was an unconcealed frostiness in his manner, and he had made none of the offers of help usually proffered to a successor. Chapter 5. Professor Arthur Cole sat in his room at St. Felix's, lovingly stroking a Ming vase. It was part of a collection of Chinese ceramics he had built up over the many years he had lived in Hong Kong and taught at the University of Hong Kong. Those years had been largely friendless, but he was not a man who needed friends or made them easily. He had contented himself with collecting Chinese pottery and porcelain, including some fragments dating back as far as the Tang dynasty. He had pursued his interest on the Chinese mainland, travelling as widely as the authorities had allowed, and visiting any number of cities, towns, and even some of the smallest villages in search of rare items. He had been lucky, gradually amassing a remarkable collection containing some very valuable items. The guides on his travels had all been employed by the Chinese government, which had insisted that he be accompanied wherever he went. This had not been a problem for Cole. It had in fact been a positive advantage, since although the guides were a mixed lot of old and young, male and female, he had found with them the chance for real personal exchange. As for his standing with their government, he knew that the best relationships are hard won. It had taken time, but gradually the People's Republic of China had seemed to realize that his admiration for their country and its art was sincere and deep. After several years, they had shown their trust in him by giving him free rein to travel where he wanted, not always accompanied. On occasion, an official would visit him in Hong Kong and ask him about his research and his students. When the offer had come from Oxford of a lectureship in his subject, combined with a fellowship at St. Felix's College, he had mentioned it casually to a government minister while he was visiting Beijing, and, to his bemusement, an official came back to him the next day urging him to accept. The PRC hoped that he would continue his visits to China, but also that, while in Oxford, he might perform small services for them and help increase the number of Chinese students studying there. This he was more than happy to do, especially as the Chinese government placed no restriction on him taking his collection back with him to England. To Arthur Cole's way of thinking, the China of the post-war world had been remarkably well governed, not that one would know that from commentators in the West. In his opinion, any country that had created items of such beauty and significance as he now owned was worthy of respect. No one starved in China anymore, something that the spoiled generation of baby boomers and their progeny of generations X and Y could never understand. When he thought of the struggle so many Chinese students had endured to get to Oxford, he could only react with scorn and distaste to the spoiled Western students of higher education. Over the following years, he had done more for the Chinese authorities than he had ever expected. This had given him the confidence to float to them his pet scheme of an institute within the college where Chinese students conducting postgraduate research could meet socially with those from other countries. It would act as a place for cultural and intellectual exchange between Chinese and European students. The Chinese government had been immediately receptive, offering financial backing, and St. Felix's had welcomed the idea, seeing it as a new source of funds and a prestigious venture. True, there had been initial resistance to his proposal from 3 or 4 xenophobic fellows, but Cole had manoeuvred round them quite adroitly. Few knew the extent of the Chinese subventions, or how cleverly they had been disguised by routing them through a Scandinavian foundation. The university at large thought the chief funding had come from a Norwegian philanthropist, made rich by his country's oil boom, and happy to pay for an educational establishment in another country, provided its brief was international. Cole had fought hard to become director of the Institute. Given his crucial role in its founding, it might have been an automatic appointment, but he was not a popular figure in college. Even he would admit that. Still, he had eventually got the job and had enjoyed 5 glorious years at the helm. He'd hoped he would be allowed to serve a second term, but the malcontents had kicked up and, under the pretext that it had never been conceived of as more than a 1-term post, removed him. Scandalously, his successor was not even an academic, just a Foreign Office stooge who might have seen much of the world but pretty much its most unimportant parts. Africa, South America, God knows where else. He hadn't made ambassador, this man, his last posting some dreary job in Whitehall. Standards must have slipped there. Abbott didn't even wear a tie most days. With his determined friendliness and open-necked shirts, he would have been anathema to Arthur Cole, whatever he did. But for him to have taken Cole's rightful place, he who had originated the Institute, seemed unspeakably unfair. Cole still had considerable influence, of course, and without letting on, enjoyed cordial relations with the Chinese. but he had a smaller room in college these days and fewer privileges to dispense officially. Though his years at St. Felix's and his role in establishing the institute meant his views could not be casually ignored. He looked at his watch. 15 minutes until his next appointment, so he thought momentarily of going to the lodge to check his post. No point. These days, 90% of his communications came via email, a development he had acceded to, though he drew the line at texting. No, he decided. He would stay put and wait for his next visitor happily enough, since he had a new print to look at that he had hung on his wall that morning. A white swan, beautifully depicted against a background of marsh and mountain. He had found it in the recent catalogue of a Hong Kong dealer, and its arrival 2 days before had been the highlight of his week. He got up from the wing-back chair and sat down at his desk, a teak beauty from a southern province, picking up the file on the student he was about to see. Opening it, he looked again at the original letter from the cultural attaché at the Chinese embassy in London, which he had received 6 weeks before. He had met his predecessor, a man roughly Cole's age named Mr. Lau, on many occasions, and they had got on well. But Lau had been promoted, it seemed, though he remained at the embassy in London. His replacement was a young man, not much past 30, who had learned his English, fluent if slightly bureaucratic, during 3 years at Stanford Business School, which he liked to talk about at irritating length. My dear Professor Cole, I write to you on behalf of a student of computer science named Li Min, who for various reasons is eager to transfer her studies to this country, and to Oxford in particular. She is a talented researcher in the field of artificial intelligence, engaged in investigating the impact new technologies will have on the humanities, surely a growing field of study at this stage. Given the potential importance of her work to my government, it seems best to place her in the institute, where we can be sure she will be well looked after. Her academic record is outstanding, and, I believe, easily good enough to justify her admission to both the institute and St. Felix's. I ask, therefore, for your help in facilitating her entry. That much Cole had done, willingly, indeed eagerly. He did not need an interpreter to help him read between the lines of the missive. If this woman would be useful to the People's Republic, then very well, he would help her. What harm could it possibly do? He was feeling content about this and enjoying the silence of his room when the quiet satisfaction of the moment was suddenly disturbed by a noise at his door. Was that a knock? His visitor was not due for another 10 minutes. Another knock came, and with a sigh he said loudly, "Come in." A man entered the room. He was casually dressed in a jacket and open-neck shirt. Still no tie, Arthur Cole noted in disapproval.
"May I have a word?"
asked Charles Abbott, the new director of the institute.
"I have a possible problem with a student. I thought I should speak to you first."
Cole was startled. Recovering, he said, "Of course. I have to see someone in a few minutes. Is that enough time, or would you like to come back later?" Later, he hoped, since once deferred, the man might not come back at all.
"It won't take long."
And it didn't. The upshot, as far as Cole could tell, was that the new director was concerned that one of the students at the institute was snooping around the rooms of some of his fellows, almost as if he was spying on them. It didn't sound very serious to Cole, more a case of too much curiosity than anything malign. But Abbott seemed to think it could be something much more sinister, part of some larger attempt to keep tabs on the student body at the institute. The snooper was a Chinese student, he said, implying that this was why he'd come to Cole. "Have you asked this person what he was doing?"
"Not yet."
"I see." There was no point getting angry, Cole told himself. Instead, he said, "You're very fortunate to have come to me."
"Oh, good,"
said Abbott. The man looked relieved, but Cole ignored this and said, "Because anyone else would report you." To Cole's satisfaction, Abbott seemed taken aback.
Report me? For what?
Racist assumptions. Unconscious racism, I'm sure, but people are pretty literal in their interpretation of these matters these days. I am, however, happy to overlook it. Just this once, mind you.
There's nothing racist about what I'm saying.
Abbott was visibly outraged by the accusation.
The student happens to be Chinese, but he could be Icelandic for all I care. I'm worried about the other students' rights to privacy, not their nationalities.
So you say. But what evidence have you that the student was doing anything but a bit of harmless snooping? From which you've jumped to conclusions I can only label highly speculative, and that's being charitable.
But...
Abbott started to protest. Cole cut him short, raising his hand to indicate that Abbott should be quiet.
Say no more, and I will do my best to overlook this unfortunate exchange. I shan't mention it to anyone else, and would strongly advise you to do the same. Now, forgive me.
He looked ostentatiously at his watch.
I have a student to see, a new arrival. She also is Chinese, and coincidentally is herself coming to join the Institute. Her name is Min, Li Min. I do hope you're not going to tell me she's a spy, too.
Chapter 6. Abbott would know better in future than to ask anything of Arthur Cole, that was now clear. It had been a mistake to consult him, if an understandable one, since the man knew China inside out and knew St. Felix's Chinese students, too. Indeed, was responsible for most of them being there. So now Abbott did what he realized he should have done to begin with. He went to see Chiao Hao. No one seemed to know why the elm was called that, since the trees surrounding it were all ancient oaks. The original building, which still stood, was an enormous red-brick Victorian family edifice built on a rise between Cumnor and Boar's Hill, southwest of Oxford, and so about a 6-mile drive from St. Felix's. Behind the Victorian mansion ran 2 wings, extensions built in the 50s, judging by their ugliness, Abbott guessed. Each held a surprising number of tiny study bedrooms. At their far end, connecting the 2 wings and making the space in between a quadrangle of sorts, was a brand-new building in black steel and glass that was handsome, if incongruous. On arriving in Oxford, Abbott had at first been puzzled by the elm and its curiously mixed architecture. It was useful in providing rooms for some of the Institute's students and housed virtually all the Chinese ones. Why would so many Chinese students want to live in the middle of the countryside rather than in Oxford, with its restaurants and cafes and cinemas and pubs, all the recreational venues of student life? Abbott parked outside the mansion, got out and walked through the front door. Inside, corridors ran to right and left towards the new wings. In front of him was the administrative office with its door standing open. Having no wish to advertise his presence, but with no idea where Chiao Hao's room was, Abbott paused. As he hesitated, the building's manager, Nina Pierpont, emerged. They had only met once, on his brief initial tour of the elm, when she had struck him as competent and professional, if perhaps a touch humourless. She could not have been much more than 40, but he had noticed on that occasion that she dressed like an older woman. Clearly, that had not been a one-off. Today, she was wearing a brown jacket and skirt, her blouse the palest possible blue, almost as though she were making a deliberate attempt to look colourless and plain. She wore no makeup or jewellery, and her shoes were dull grey flats.
"Can I help you?"
she called out sharply, as if for a suspicious person who needed to be challenged.
"Oh, hello,"
Abbott said. Recognizing him, she flushed slightly.
"Forgive me, Mr. Abbott. I didn't realize it was you. Can I help with anything?"
He didn't really want anyone to know he was seeing Chiao Hao, so shook his head.
"Thanks, no, I'll manage."
He could see she was curious, but ignored her and went towards some swing doors leading to one wing. As they closed behind him, he resisted the impulse to look back, but he was sure Pierpont was still watching. He got lucky. He was in the right wing. Jia Hao's room was on the second floor. He knocked, wondering if they should talk in here or retire to the cafe on the ground floor of the new building. When no one answered, he knocked again, but no sound came from within. He tried the door handle, not really ready to enter uninvited, but thinking that if it were unlocked, it meant Jia Hao was somewhere nearby. But when the handle turned easily in his hand, he gave the door the smallest encouragement, and it swung inwards and open. Looking in, he was taken aback to find that the room was empty. Not just unoccupied, but stripped bare. Bedding, clothes, personal effects. There was nothing there, or in the tiny bathroom. He knew that at the end of term, students were required to empty their rooms completely in readiness for the business conferences held at the Elm during the vacation weeks. But term had just started. So where was Jia Hao? Or had Abbott got the room number wrong? He stepped back out into the corridor as a student came along, a Westerner. He didn't seem to recognize Abbott, who stopped him, saying,
"Excuse me, I'm looking for Jia Hao. Do you know where his room is?"
The boy stared at him.
"That's it there,"
he said, pointing at the door Abbott had just come out of.
"But they say he's gone home." "Home? Hong Kong, I think. I'm not sure. I didn't see him leave. One of the others told me." "Right,"
said Abbott, nodding, inwardly disturbed by this news. On his way out, he stopped at the office and, finding Nina Pierpont back behind her desk, said cheerfully from the doorway,
"I was looking for a student named Jia Hao, but I gather he's left us."
"Yes."
"He seemed to think someone had been in his room, going through his things."
"I know," she said with a loud sigh.
"I thought I'd better come see what he was on about."
"I'm not a psychiatrist, but if you ask me, Mr. Jia was a clear case of paranoia. He kept complaining, so we even changed the locks on his door for him."
"He mentioned a Mr. Chu,"
said Abbott a little reluctantly, since he didn't like bandying accusations about, especially second-hand. Pierpont was shaking her head. "Cherchez la femme," she said, then seeing Abbott's puzzlement, explained, "They were both interested in the same young woman. I'm afraid it's a pretty clear case of jealousy raising its ugly head. As I understand it, in the competition for the girl's hand," she said, smiling wryly, "Mr. Chu was the winner. He's a great big chap, our Mr. Chu, not like little Mr. Cha. And Mr. Cha hated him, probably for that reason."
"Ah, I see. Well, anyway, do you know where Jia Hao has gone?"
Pierpont looked suddenly a little flustered. "He's flown home. To Hong Kong. I don't know for how long."
"Was this expected? I mean, term's barely started."
"Well, I certainly didn't know about it until he came by this morning and returned the room key. He said there was a family emergency. I didn't think I could question it."
"No, of course not. I suppose we'll hear more eventually."
Pierpont said nothing, even when he waited a bit. So at length he said,
"Please let me know if you hear from him or anyone else does."
"All right," she said, but the request seemed to have gone down badly. Why? Wondered Abbott as he walked slowly towards his car. He sat in it for a while, wondering what he should do next. Since there was nothing useful to be done at the Elm, he decided to go up to the old barn perched on top of a low hill a few hundred yards away. It belonged to the Institute, but Abbott realized he had never inspected the building. So he turned his car and drove up a rough farm track to the front of the barn. He parked and got out, thinking he would have a quick look inside before getting back to Oxford. Just then, a man came out of the open door, dressed in olive workwear, shirt and trousers. He was tall, with a farmer's build, forearms the size of lamb shanks and a pot belly formed by too many hours spent behind the wheel of a farm vehicle.
"Good morning,"
Abbott said politely.
"I'm Charles Abbott, and I wonder if I might take a quick look inside this building." "Oh, no,"
said the other man, sounding defiant.
"You can't come inside here. The council's been out and they say the building isn't safe. Concrete substandard. Beams could give way any time now."
Abbott was taken aback. He wondered if the man was always this rude. He said a little crossly,
"What is your job here, and what's your name?" "Who's asking?"
the man demanded.
"The director of the Institute."
In case there were still any grounds for misunderstanding, he added,
"That's me."
It was the other man's turn to look surprised.
"I'm Gilroy,"
he said grudgingly, though not quite as gruffly.
"I do the maintenance around here." "Okay, Mr. Gilroy. I'm just going to take a look round." "Be careful, then. I tell you, this place needs a lot of repair work. It's half falling down, but no one wants to spend any money putting it right."
All the same, he followed Abbott into the building. Abbott took a few steps inside and peered around. On the barn's floor there were a few spades, various other tools propped up against a wall, and several bales of hay. A ladder in one corner led up to a hayloft, but he could see that there was nothing up there.
"So, you don't keep any animals?"
he said to Gilroy.
"No,"
came his reply.
"The animals you see belong to the farmer in the next field. He keeps his hay here, but to tell you the truth, there isn't much need for this place. I just store stuff here."
Abbott nodded. He walked out of the barn, and Gilroy followed him.
"You've got a pretty good view,"
Abbott remarked. Then, after a pause,
"I wonder whether you saw any strangers at the Elm yesterday evening or this morning. Like a car you hadn't seen before, that kind of thing." "No. Just the shuttle bus going off to Oxford, same as usual. I knock off at 5 in the evening, so I didn't see anything last night because I wasn't here." "Okay,"
said Abbott. He added,
"Great Land Rover you've got here. How old is it?"
he asked, stroking the side of the parked vehicle.
"Must go back to the 90s at least, yes? Or more. You keep it very well,"
he said, looking inside and seeing nothing remarkable except that the backs of the rear seats were down, making a large space in the rear.
"What do you use it for?" "Oh, just moving the hay bales when I help out the farmer,"
said Gilroy dismissively, beginning to walk away.
"Well, thanks," said Abbott. "I'll see if there's anything I can do about the state of the barn." "Good on you,"
said the man, not looking back over his shoulder. I wouldn't trust him further than I could throw him, thought Abbott as he walked back to the car. Why do we seem to employ such uncommunicative characters? He wondered as he drove away. Chapter 7. When he got back to Oxford, Abbott wondered what to do next. Was it pure coincidence that Jia Hao's warning letter had almost immediately been followed by his hasty departure? It seemed improbable. And Cole had reacted so strongly and weirdly when told about the letter. If there was anything in the young man's accusations, Abbott really needed the input of someone who knew about security threats, could judge whether this was likely to be something serious or whether it could be safely ignored. He knew no one at Oxford who could advise him. And then he thought of Mark Delaney. They had first met while both at the embassy in Damascus. Then, by coincidence, Delaney had turned up at the embassy in Istanbul, where Abbott had been cultural attaché. They had always got along well. Delaney was an MI6 officer, Abbott a counsellor specialising in trade matters. In that role, he met many people in all walks of life and so had been able to help Delaney make useful contacts. He was a man with a mission, or rather many missions it seemed, but terrific company and a keen tennis player. Abbott had a decent game of his own, and they played every week on a variety of courts. And Gillian and Delaney's wife had liked each other. Aggie had a good sense of humour, which appealed to Gillian. The two couples socialised together, played doubles, picnicked, swam, and had generally enjoyed themselves in their off-duty moments. After Istanbul, they had lost touch, but through a mutual acquaintance, Abbott knew that the Delaneys were now back in London. Had Gillian still been alive, he and she would have been in touch by now, and probably started to see their old friends again. Abbott's failure to contact them so far was because of his wife's absence. Seeing them would just remind him, as so much else already did, of how much he was missing her. For their own part, the Delaneys' silence seemed to show that they understood his feelings. As he worked his way through Oxford's one-way system, which deserved its description as the unique creation of warped minds, Abbott wondered whether he could really bother Mark with the problem of Jia Hao. Maybe, left alone, it would simply go away. But then he recalled what Nina Pierpont had just said about Jia Hao's sudden return home, and decided then and there he would go ahead and ring his old friend. After all, he remembered from the student's file that Jia Hao was an orphan. And what kind of orphan has a family emergency? Mark Delaney couldn't have been friendlier on the phone, even when Abbott explained that it wasn't purely a social call and that he had something work-related he wanted to talk to him about. Delaney was busy that day. There was some crisis in Lebanon. But late the next morning, Abbott disembarked at Paddington, took the Bakerloo line to Oxford Circus, and crossed the river on the Victoria line. At Vauxhall, he got off and found his old friend waiting for him at the top of the Underground station steps.
"I thought we'd have a quick lunch. There's a nice bistro down the street."
As they walked south, they chatted. Delaney said how sad he and his wife had been to hear about Gillian's death, but otherwise kept off the subject, to Abbott's relief. He was pleased to see that Delaney was the same as ever. Tall and athletic, now with some grey streaks in his dark hair, he walked with the springy steps of the tennis player he had always been. Abbott asked if he was likely to be going abroad again, but Delaney said no, he would be in London for the next few years. His children were happily settled at school here, and Aggie had found herself a job that she was really enjoying. He was interested in Abbott's new life in Oxford, and rather envious to hear where he was living. He had loved his time there as an undergraduate, over 30 years before. Turning off Harleyford Road, they went down a little side street to the bistro. Delaney must have been a regular here, thought Abbott, since the owner greeted them with a big smile and led them, without any prompting, to a table in a quiet corner at the back. It was only as they finished ordering that conversation turned to the matter at hand. Delaney's expression sobered slightly, and he said, "Now, tell me what's up." He listened to Abbott's account of Jia Hao's letter in his pigeonhole, the conversation with Professor Cole, his visit to the Elm, discovery of the student's empty room, and the conversation with Miss Pierpont. When he finished, Delaney sat still for a moment, then sipped from his wine. Putting the glass down, he said, "Thanks for getting in touch and telling me about it. You did the right thing. We've heard of this sort of thing going on in universities all over the Western world, but not here so far. The Americans are taking a particular interest in it, and I'd like to mention it to my counterpart at the London CIA station. I think he'll be very interested to hear your story. Would you be happy for me to share with him what you've told me?"
"Yes, of course," said Abbott, looking relieved. "I'd be delighted for you to do that."
"I'd better warn you now. We may need your help in pursuing this."
Chapter 8. David Saunders was head of counterintelligence for the CIA in London and had been in the UK for 5 years, an almost unprecedented stint in the post and evidence of how well thought of he was. On first encounter, he cut an unprepossessing figure. He was short and wiry and looked more like a building society manager than a high-ranking CIA officer, one who did hill walking as a weekend hobby. But as Delaney had long ago concluded, behind the modest facade lurked a formidable brain. Saunders was dressed today in a dark blue suit, its formality relieved by a bright yellow tie. Delaney wondered if he had been lunching out, since his normal office wear did not run to suit and tie. His office, on one of the higher floors of the new American Embassy at 9 Elms, faced north towards the river. It was Delaney's first visit there, and Saunders showed off the view of Tate Britain, with the Houses of Parliament looming in the distance, and in between, a glimpse of the large, squat building with a copper roof, housing Britain's Domestic Intelligence Service, MI5. He ushered Delaney towards a sofa set against one wall of the room, and himself sat on a chair on the other side of a low coffee table.
Have a seat, and I'll send for some coffee. From what you said on the phone, I think we may both have stumbled on the same racket, but it's best if you start right from the beginning and tell me what you know.
Delaney did his best to keep his account concise, while Saunders made notes on his pad. The American listened carefully as Delaney described St. Felix's College and its relatively new Institute of International and Cultural Affairs, where his old friend Charles Abbott was the recently appointed director. He went on to explain as clearly as he could what had happened after a Chinese student contacted Abbott to complain that he was under surveillance. When he stopped speaking, there was a short silence, and then Saunders asked,
"Who else knows about this letter Jiao Hao wrote Abbott?" "Well, Abbott tried to talk to his predecessor, the one who had founded the Institute, but when asked what he made of Jiao Hao's accusations, the man dismissed them out of hand. What's more, he accused Abbott of racism for taking the complaint seriously. The man is an old Hong Kong hand, and in spite of what has happened there recently, is still very pro-Chinese. Abbott wishes he hadn't gone to see him." "Has Abbott told anybody else? Any of the authorities?" "You mean the police?" "I mean in the university, though actually anybody else at all. In fact, anybody who might inadvertently have spilled the beans about this letter."
Delaney explained that Abbott was a widower, and felt a guilty pang as he said it. He and his wife really should have pushed more to see their old friend. He said Abbott had thought of going to the principal, which was the title of the head of St. Felix's, but the man was new in his post and, frankly, struggling a bit to win the respect of the fellows. Abbott had said he couldn't see that there was anything the principal could do about it, not without firmer evidence than he had. Saunders nodded. There was a pause while he got up from his chair, took off his jacket, chucked it over a peg, and said,
"I'm glad you came to see me about this. I want to take you into my confidence. I'm already talking to Wilson at 5. We're working together on a case that sounds very similar. A colleague of mine has just come over from Langley to work with us. You may remember her. She was very closely involved in the business of that MP who turned out to be a Russian spy." "Yes, I remember. Anyway, I want to have her in so that we can talk further about how your story connects with what we're already doing. She's in the office now. I'll ask her to join us if that's okay." "Yes, I'd like to meet her. I remember the Robinson case, and I know Wilson well. We were colleagues once."
Manon was still jet-lagged from the flight, but found, as usual, that plunging straight into work was the best way to fight the time-change fatigue. On the flight over, she had worked her way through background material about St. Felix's College and an internal agency guide to artificial intelligence that she found hard-going. Now, when Saunders came into the little room she'd been assigned for the day, she was scanning an account of the Institute at St. Felix's, written by its ex-director, a man named Cole, in the college's alumni magazine, and was also wondering how she was going to approach Li Min, by now presumably settled in Oxford. Plus, Manon would need to find a place to stay there for herself. There was much to do.
"Something's come up,"
Saunders announced, appearing in the doorway. He had welcomed her a few hours before when she had arrived, fresh from the airport, but then left her alone.
"Sorry about this, Manon. You've barely got your feet wet and you must be tired. I find jet lag is much worse coming this way. But I know you'll want to hear this. There's a guy from MI6 who's come to see me, and I'd like you to join us in a little while. I won't say anything more than that, since he can explain better than I can, but it could help us with this woman Li Min."
It was half an hour before Saunders' secretary came to collect Manon, time enough for her to ponder what had happened to bring MI6 over to the US Embassy. She knocked lightly on the door to his office and went in, finding him standing by the window, talking to a lanky man seated on the sofa. She was relieved, given Saunders' formal garb, to see that the visitor was wearing a jacket and open-necked shirt, since Manon herself had not expected any meetings today and was dressed informally in jeans and a light blue sweatshirt, with her long brown hair tied up in a ponytail. Saunders explained to her that Delaney was from MI6 and had a story that seemed to relate very closely to what Manon was initially meant to be working on, investigating Li Min's sudden removal from Harvard and transfer to Oxford. After giving the bones of the story, Saunders said,
"As you see, Manon, it's the same college both times, St. Felix's. The institute there seems to be a magnet to Chinese students."
Turning to Delaney, he said,
"It looks as though, quite separately, we may have stumbled onto something."
They went on to discuss how the two cases might connect. Delaney mentioned that Abbott, who had come to him with his concerns about Chinese spying at the Institute, was an old friend. "I do wonder," said Manon, "why your man Cha Hao was also moved all the way across the Atlantic from Princeton to Oxford. It's a long way to go. Do we know what he was working on, or what their target for him at St. Felix's could be?"
Saunders said, No, I expect Abbott can find out. We may be looking at the tip of an iceberg. I'm interested to hear that Jia Hao thought he was being snooped on. It looks as though the PRC didn't trust him."
Manon said, "And perhaps they were right. His letter sounds unusually outspoken," she commented to Delaney.
"Yes," he said. "You'd think they would have tested his reliability before they sent him all this way. I wonder if this man Chu found out about the letter to the director. Why else would Jia Hao leave so quickly?"
"That must be the reason," said Manon. She glanced at Saunders, waiting for him to speak. There was a pause, and then he said, looking at Delaney, "I'd better tell you about the plan that's been discussed with Wilson at 5. Following up on Li Min's letter telling us that she would be at St. Felix's College, we've decided we'd like to send Manon up there to try and get in on the action somehow." He looked at her and nodded, so she addressed Delaney. "Now that you've told us about the Institute and your friend Abbott, I'm wondering whether we could call on him for assistance. Do you think he's a man who could play a part in an undercover operation of this kind? You know the kind of thing I mean." Delaney thought for a moment, then said,
"I've known him for years. He was a counselor in the Foreign Office and very helpful to me in some fairly dodgy postings overseas. He's discreet, and I think would be prepared to take part in the sort of operation you probably have in mind. Just let me know when you'd like to meet him. In the meantime, do you want me to give him your name?"
Here Saunders interjected.
"It will probably be an alias. We'll work on a cover and then we'll let you know."
Delaney smiled at Manon.
"Okay. I'll tell Charles to wait to hear from Madame Mysterious."
Chapter 9. She had wanted to meet on Addison's walk behind Magdalen College, which she had recently discovered as part of getting to know her new environment. Li Min was diligent like that. At Harvard, she had visited every one of the residential houses in the first 4 weeks she was there. She had some way to go in Oxford to match that, having only arrived 10 days before. But Deng had balked at her choice, seeming wary of meeting so near to one of the colleges. He had proposed the cafe at Blackwell's bookshop, not seeming to realize that there were few less private places in the city. Eventually, they had agreed to meet in Holywell Cemetery, which was a ghoulish choice, but one where their meeting was unlikely to attract interest. She found Deng waiting for her at the far end of the cemetery, sitting on a bench near a towering cedar of Lebanon. Even on this breezy day, he wore no coat, only his standard uniform of black suit, white shirt, and unremarkable tie. Li Min had been startled by the text message from him summoning her to the meeting, having expected to have a new controller based at the embassy in London. But it seemed Deng, too, had made the transfer across the Atlantic, and there must have been an important reason for that. Then, with a start of surprise, Li Min realized it might have something to do with her. There was never any small talk with Deng, and his questions now were specific and to the point. Was she living in the Elm outside the city? Yes. Had she established herself in her department and met with her advisor? Yes, on both counts, though he didn't seem very interested when she complained that the facilities at her new research lab were not what she was used to, and they had different approaches here to AI audio generation. She added that her advisor spent most of his time at the university's Internet Center on St. Giles and seemed happy for Li Min to decide herself how best to move forward with her research. Right, said Deng impatiently, and had she met other students in her field? Only a few so far, though there would be a drinks party the following Saturday for all the students in the institute. And what about at the Elm? There, she had been more socially successful. Living in such close proximity, she could not help but meet people, and it was easy to fall into conversation at mealtimes with her fellow Chinese. He returned to the topic of her work at the lab, explaining that he would, as at Harvard, expect regular reports.
On your progress,
Deng said specifically, and it was clear he saw this as being more important than the work other people were engaged on. But his instructions lacked the urgency they usually conveyed and seemed almost cursory. Li Min wondered why.
Now,
said Deng, with the air of someone finally getting down to business.
Have you been to see Professor Cole?
She nodded, but not happily. She had found the man both stiff and condescending. He had asked her about her work, but not listened to the answers, and she had the feeling he was reluctant to extend any kind of intellectual respect to women. Something impish in her stirred as she recalled their introductory meeting. I thought he was a patronizing idiot, she declared. Startled, Deng looked at her as if to check that he had heard her right. Then, for the first time in their long, if spasmodic acquaintance, he laughed, out loud, uncontrolled, and, just as suddenly, stopped. He said,
I understand he is an idiot, but he is useful to us. A useful idiot. He will help you without demanding to know why. Remember that.
He looked at his watch, a habit of his which Li Min always found annoying.
Now,
he declared,
there is someone I want you to get to know.
At the lab? He shook his head.
No, but she is living at the Elm.
Li Min said,
Is she Chinese?
Deng replied,
Not exactly. Her mother is, but the daughter is not really Chinese.
There were Western students at the Elm, but they were there for the most part because they could not find more convenient, affordable accommodation in the city. Deng continued.
Her name is Washington. Sally Washington. Her father is American, and she is from that country. I'm not sure what she is studying. Some social sciences rubbish,
he said dismissively. So, her work was not important to Deng, thought Li Min. Good. She was tired of stealing the fruits of other people's labors. But if this were the case, then why should she bother with this Washington woman?
You just want me to become her friend?
She asked.
Yes.
Is that all?
Had she really been forced to stop in her tracks, move across the Atlantic, and possibly jeopardize her career prospects, purely in order to become the friend of some half-Chinese, half-American girl? It couldn't be the only reason for this upheaval in her life, surely. And when Deng hesitated, she knew she was right. Something further would be required of her.
No,
he said at last, almost reluctantly, and lowered his voice.
But all in good time. I will explain in due course. After you have won this young woman's trust."
Li Min left the meeting none the wiser, knowing only that she would have to continue to issue reports on her colleagues to Deng in London and, more urgently, find Sally Washington and become her friend. What if she couldn't contrive a way of meeting the woman? Worse, what if she did, but the woman didn't like her? It all seemed indescribably vague, yet potentially difficult too. She wondered what the endgame really was. Obviously something to do with this woman personally, not her work. Li Min was now in the middle of town, halfway along the Broad, at the northern end of the mixed colleges and shops along the Turl. She went and bought some makeup in Boots, then stared through window displays at clothes she couldn't afford along the high street. She looked at her watch and realized she had just missed the shuttle back to the Elm. There wouldn't be another for an hour, so, still mulling over the baffling exchange with Deng, she decided to walk down to the river. Across the High, down an alleyway the width of a big man's shoulders, and then into Christchurch Meadow. The path there ran in a circular loop of a little over a mile. She set out along it briskly. When she reached the river, she paused only briefly to watch a couple of the eights setting out from the boathouses that dotted the bank, then continued on the little circuit into the woods on the southeast corner of the meadows. Here she saw only the occasional jogger, until walking at some pace she found herself rapidly gaining ground on a couple of men ahead of her and slowed down. As she did so, she recognized one of them. A diminutive man, ebony hair cut short, wearing a black suit and city shoes. Immediately she hung back. She didn't want Deng to think she was spying on him as he met another contact. If he saw her, there was no obvious excuse she could give for being there. Next to Deng, the other man was much taller, wide-shouldered too, and when he turned his head sideways to look at Deng, she saw that he was not only Chinese, but familiar. From the Elm. What was his name? She had met him at dinner, where he had complained about the cafeteria's alien Western food. Chow? Chang? Something like that. And then the name Chu flew into her head and stayed there. Chapter 10. The taxi dropped Manon at the flat she had rented in North Oxford. Once, not long before, she had stayed in a flat rather like this during a particularly stressful period of her life. It had been her introduction, entirely unplanned, to the world of CIA operations, in which she was now a fully fledged agent. She hoped that in any crisis, or while facing any physical threat, she would remain determined and calm, as she had been trained to be. She had been lucky to find a flat now that term had started. The owner, who lived in a palatial house on Woodstock Road, had explained on the phone that it had already been rented once, but the tenant had changed his mind about doing graduate work and, despite losing his deposit, had surrendered the lease. Hence its reappearance in the university's daily online information sheet, where, to her relief, Manon had found it. The flat consisted of the ground floor of a 2-story red-brick Victorian house. Inside the shared front hall, a staircase led to another flat upstairs. Judging from the posts that had accumulated on a side table in the hall, nobody had lived up there for some time. Good. Manon wanted a quiet place with privacy and no inquisitive neighbours. Her flat turned out to be tidy, freshly cleaned, and small, but then she didn't need a lot of space and had only brought one large suitcase with her. She had no idea how long she was going to be here, but could always go back to London for more stuff if she needed it. To the right of the hallway, there was a little sitting room that overlooked the road. It was lined with bookshelves that were full of history books, doubtless a dumping ground for books the landlady had no room for in her own place. Down the corridor, there was a bedroom, decorated simply in light colours that felt cheery. On the bed, the landlady had left clean folded sheets and towels, happily supplied for an extra charge. Next door, the compact bathroom had a shower head above the tub. At the end of the hall, in the back of the house, the kitchen was petite but had all the basics, as well as a combo washer-dryer that would save her from making trips to the laundrette. The room overlooked a strip of garden in which Manon was glad to see a few hints of summer, a flourish of early peonies, and buds sprouting on a rosebush that needed pruning. It was all perfectly comfortable and ideal for a visiting academic. She was looking forward to seeing Charles Abbott in the morning at the Institute. They had spent a day together in the embassy in London working on her cover story. Saunders did not want Manon anywhere near St. Felix's until she was ready to arrive there in her new identity. Abbott had quickly understood this and had joined in enthusiastically. It was his idea that they might have met at a conference he had attended in America.
And you might have been, let's say, a junior research librarian, something rather vague, but that sounds reasonably high-powered. Let's say someone who used to work at the Library of Congress, but now, as actors like to say, you're resting, so you're no longer on the accredited staff. And, in fact, at the Institute we do have a large uncatalogued collection of books and papers, some of which relate to our foundation, given to us by scholars and academics.
Feeling tired? Let's take 60 seconds to unwind with a song. This free audiobook is here for your relaxation. Thank you for being here with us.
Thin and light, gentle sway, leaves like tickets blown away. Autumn's breath carries far, dancing softly under stars. Fragile leaves floating high, graceful in the autumn sky.
Academics, all in a terrible mess and needing to be put into some sort of order so as to be available to be used academically in the future.
That sounds like a good idea, said Manon. But why would I have wanted to come all the way to Oxford to help you out with your problem?
Because you like the look of me?
Said Abbott with a grin. No, that won't do, Manon said, laughing. She was beginning to warm to this man. We need something more solid than that. What if I wanted an excuse to take a sabbatical in Europe, but couldn't afford to pay for it myself? Are you offering me a salary for spending some time helping you at your institute? I don't mean you really have to, but just for the purposes of the story.
Yes,
said Abbott.
It sounds perfectly realistic.
So that was what they had settled on, and both Saunders and the operational security team, who had to provide all the documentation needed to back up Manon's new identity, had agreed it sounded credible. Manon had spent a couple of weeks reading up about the practice of archiving and sorting out the details of her own background story, how old she was, her family members, where she had been at school, etc. The real Manon had grown up in western Massachusetts, where her father had taught American history at a small liberal arts college, and her mother, coincidentally, in light of Manon's cover, had been head of their town's public library. The covers that were easiest to use were closest to the truth, so Judith Davidson, the name Manon would adopt in her new role, had a similar background to her real-life one, which made it easy to remember how old she was, 29, her family members and their names, and the schools and college she had attended. All the usual things that people ask when they first meet you. Now, as she settled into her flat, she was looking forward to getting on with the job. Chapter 11. The next morning, Manon set out early for St. Felix's, striding down the main thoroughfare of Woodstock Road as commuters' cars crawled along it in rush hour. She was at the college a few minutes before 9 when she had her appointment with Charles Abbott and asked at the lodge for directions to the Institute. Her route lay through an ancient quadrangle and out the other side of a narrow passage before crossing a wide expanse of grass to reach a new wing, cleverly designed so as not to quarrel with the original medieval buildings of the college. Inside reception, she was directed to some swing doors, then went up a staircase to a corridor where she found a door marked Director's Office. She knocked and heard a cheerful call of,
"Come in."
As she opened the door, Charles Abbott stood up from his desk and came forward to meet her.
"Come in and sit down,"
he said. He was 46 years old, Manon knew from Delaney, though in his blue cotton suit and open-necked shirt he looked years younger. He had wavy dark hair with streaks of grey in it. She'd liked his face when she'd first met him. A strong chin, dark blue eyes, a sharp, straight nose. A handsome man, disarmingly rather than aggressively so. He offered coffee, which she declined, and they sat to either side of his desk.
"It's nice to see you again, Manon,"
he said.
"Though, from now on, I must remember to call you Judith."
She nodded. It's the easiest thing to slip up on.
"When did you arrive in Oxford?"
I came up from London yesterday.
"Have you found somewhere to stay?"
A flat off Woodstock Road. You thought that staying in the Elm would make me a bit conspicuous.
"Wouldn't have been very nice, either,"
said Abbott, and they both laughed.
"Anyhow, I'm delighted you're here, and will take any help with the papers you can give. But don't worry about that side of things. I appreciate your priority is this student Li Min."
Have you heard anything more from the disappeared student Jia Hao?
"Not a peep, and I don't expect to. I just hope we can find out if his claims that spying is going on here are true. We really can't have that."
What about this Mr. Chu he claimed to have seen rifling through his possessions?
"He's still here, but I haven't felt able to ask him about it since Jiao Hao is no longer around to tell his side of the story. Anyway, I thought I'd wait for your arrival."
She laughed at his honesty, conceding that it would be hard to tackle Chu on the basis of Jiao Hao's not altogether coherent letter. Albert had sent a copy of it to Saunders at Delaney's request, and Manon had seen it. Jiao Hao's accusations were alarming, but she wished he had been more specific or that he'd stuck around to give more details. Can you tell me anything much about this Mr. Chu? What is his field?
"Medieval history. Please don't ask me any more. My knowledge stops right there, of both Mr. Chu and medieval history."
She said, As Dave Saunders mentioned in London, we're interested in finding out more about the Chinese government's control of its students here, especially if that leads us to learn precisely what they're asking them to do. We're hoping to find at least one student who will talk. She mentioned Li Min and their hopes of recruiting her, and Abbott nodded, though he seemed deep in thought about something else. When she stopped talking, he said,
"Sorry, I was just thinking of something. Obviously, my knowledge of China, much less its government, is pretty limited. My predecessor here is a different story, however, and you should get to know him. His name is Arthur Cole, and he still does the odd bit of teaching. I should add that he is not well disposed towards me. He was desperate to stay on as director and is very bitter that it wasn't allowed. In fairness, I can't blame him. He was chiefly responsible for founding the institute to begin with."
Will I find him in college?
"Yes, but I suggest you approach him indirectly."
When Manon raised an eyebrow, Abbott explained.
"He can be a bit grumpy."
He paused.
"Especially with women. My late wife was not an admirer."
A misogynist, thought Manon, who had dealt with plenty of them before. Abbott said,
"But maybe I'm being unfair and you'll get on with him very well. It's just that he's—"
He was searching in vain for the right words. Difficult? If not an outright woman-hater?
"Precisely,"
Abbott said with relief.
"I'll tell you what, there's a guest night tomorrow evening for High Table. You could come as my guest and I'll make sure you're seated next to Cole. That will give you an intro without having to seek him out on a pretext."
"Thank you," said Manon, wondering just how bad Cole could be.
"I'll put McCaffrey on the other side of you as an antidote. He's one of the history dons and can be very entertaining. You can talk to him about libraries."
Abbott said this with a straight face, but laughed when she gave him a look of mock horror.
"I'm sorry, I shouldn't tease you."
He stood up.
"Come on, I'll show you your office. It's downstairs, but it does have a view."
Settled in her new office quarters, her laptop open and some books on the desk, Manon surveyed what she was allegedly here to do. The room was full of boxes, presumably crammed with the archive Abbott had been talking to her about. In the distance, she could see a church tower bathed in pale spring sunlight. She found herself thinking about Abbott. The boxes could wait. He seemed a curious man, not at all the stuffy diplomat she'd imagined. How long had he been widowed for? She admired the fact he had at one point mentioned his wife quite matter-of-factly, and she liked his sense of humour. Though she hoped he wouldn't go on teasing her. She had an older brother back in the States for that. Still, he seemed a gentle man, in the best possible way, with the gentleness coming from inner strength and a clear sense of who he was. Enough with the psychoanalysis, she decided, and thought how best to move ahead with what she was here for, which wasn't to sort out a load of papers. She pondered how best to approach Li Min. Having never actually met the student, Manon could hardly contrive to bump into her accidentally, either on the street or in college, and forcing an acquaintance would be difficult as well. If Manon went to the Elm for supper, hoping to wangle a seat near Li Min, she would stick out like a sore thumb. The old-fashioned means of communication seemed the only plausible way forward, and she wrote a note accordingly. "Dear Li Min, I'm a friend of Louise Donovan of Harvard, who said you had recently come to study here at St. Felix's. By happy chance, I am working in the Institute this term, and wonder if you would like to meet up for coffee sometime. I am living in North Oxford, but come to college every day and have quite a free schedule. Best wishes, Judith Davidson." She didn't post this note, or send it through the inter-college mail system, which was a skeleton of its former self, superseded by email. Instead, she put it into Li Min's pigeonhole in the porter's lodge of St. Felix's. It would be difficult for anyone to pilfer it or pre-examine it there, with a battery of porters just a few feet away. Now, the only worry was whether Li Min would reply. Chapter 12. Li Min was more confident now that she would be able to do good work in Oxford.
Hi, just a quick pause. Take a moment to relax and breathe. Here's a short musical interlude, and remember, this audiobook is completely free for you. Thanks for listening.
That calls me near, leading me to you, leading me to you.
She would have to do it mainly on her own, she realized, as the university seemed well behind Harvard in the field of AI-generated simulations, audio or video. If anything, Oxford seemed suspicious of these developments, as Li Min found from almost the beginning. She asked another student in the lab, a girl from Leeds named Alicia, to sit for her and read aloud from a book Li Min picked at random. In this case, it was a novel by Ian McEwan called The Comfort of Strangers. A few pages of audio proved ample, and 2 days later, Li Min had an audio streaming file that had Alicia's voice talking for a good 5 minutes, describing tourist sites in Oxford, moving from the Ashmolean to the eastern end of the Broad and the Bodleian Library. The words themselves were completely banal. With Alicia's help on film, too, it should be possible to create a video simulation within the next few weeks. The result would be the production of Li Min's first complete deepfake, one that was utterly harmless, yet a considerable achievement. But given the audio file to listen to, Alicia had, to put it bluntly, freaked out. At first, she had been convinced she had somehow, somewhere, been overheard and taped actually talking about Oxford. Such was the uncanny accuracy of the fabricated speaking voice. Attempts by Li Min to reassure her that she had never actually said these words had only panicked Alicia more. She had gone to the head of the lab, Terry Harrison, in a complete state. To his credit, Harrison had seemed more astonished by Li Min's achievement than disapproving. Referring to Alicia's reaction, he said, "There are probably ethical issues involved here, but to tell you the truth, I think the problem is that it's scary. Or at least, she finds it so." Li Min didn't know what to say. She found her work exciting. No one had found it frightening at Harvard, or raised any moral questions about it. Fortunately, she and Harrison had agreed on a compromise. Li Min could continue her work on AI-generated video and audio simulations of real people, but none of the real people from the lab would serve as unwitting guinea pigs. Where she would find cooperative subjects was another matter, and, as the lab manager made clear, something for her to sort out herself. Before tackling that, however, Li Min had another problem to focus on. Since only 48 hours after their rendezvous in Holywell Cemetery, Deng was texting her, asking if she had made friends yet with Sally Washington. Li Min had already noticed the young woman with eye-catching blonde highlights in her brown hair. Strikingly pretty, she had wide cheekbones and pale hazel eyes. On the Elms website, there was a page devoted to brief biographies of all the residents, sometimes accompanied by a photograph. That was voluntary. Not every student wanted their picture up. Sally Washington was one of the abstainers, but Li Min was somehow confident that the talkative woman she'd spotted had to be her. She was from the United States, her bio said, where she had taken an undergraduate degree at Sonoma College in California. At Oxford, she was studying for an MA in international relations, though there seemed to be little that was international about her friends. At mealtimes, she sat with a small group of what had to be Americans from the noise they made. They seemed to have nothing to do with the Chinese, or indeed any British or Europeans either. Li Min was afraid that if she tried to join them, she would either be rebuffed or seem too keen to get to know Sally Washington. California came to the rescue quite accidentally. A friend of Li Min's at Harvard had given her a sweatshirt for her last birthday, a rich red one that had, in the habit of American educational institutions, a name emblazoned in prominent letters on the front. UCSF. In a circle below was the crest of the University of California. When the weather cooled and she wore the sweatshirt one day, it made Li Min stand out vividly among her black-and-white attired fellow Chinese students. And luckily, when she came into the dining hall one evening wearing it and joined the queue for the cafeteria-style service, she caught the eye of Sally Washington 2 places ahead of her. "UCSF!" the American woman exclaimed, her voice resonant with Californian tones. "Wow, dude! Are you from San Francisco?" "Nah," said Li Min, doing her best to sound relaxed and Californian herself. "I was at Harvard." Sally nodded, but seemed impressed, though studying at Oxford put her in a transatlantic Ivy League as well. Li Min pressed on as Sally lingered. "But I love California." "Me too," said Sally. "Listen, why don't you join us?" She pointed towards the tables in the hall. "Unless you're eating with someone else?" "Not tonight," said Li Min, as if her social calendar was usually full. "Save me a seat and I'll come over." She found a seat left empty among the small huddle of Americans, perhaps half a dozen of them. Li Min slid into it quickly, having put down her tray. "This is—" Sally Washington started to say, and then, looking at Li Min, laughed. "You know, I don't even know your name."
I am Li Min.
One of the boys, wearing a green t-shirt with a ponytail and wispy beard, said,
"Are you from China?"
He sounded incredulous, as if asking whether she had been to the moon. Li Min nodded, then added quickly,
"But I have been in the States, at Harvard."
She felt very alien among these Americans, a strange feeling since in Massachusetts she had known lots of Westerners and had friends among them. The boy with the ponytail said,
"Can I ask you a question?"
Without waiting for permission, he went on.
"Why won't the Chinese students here talk to us?"
Li Min's eyes widened.
We think you won't talk to us.
"Really? We figured you were forbidden to socialize with Westerners."
Forbidden?
No one had told her this. Even Deng had never tried to regulate her social life. It was work where he wanted her input, especially about her colleagues. He could hardly tell her to stay away from the people whose findings she was supposed to steal.
"By your government, I mean, no offense," he added.
No one has ever told me to stay away from the white devils.
She said this in a high-pitched, mock-official tone of voice, trying to make a joke of it. But there was silence at the table. Then Sally laughed loudly, and it seemed the ice was suddenly broken. After that, conversation flowed more easily, and it helped when they stopped asking Li Min questions about China, and instead started talking in free-for-all fashion in the normal student way. About the Elm's food, and the unreliability of the shuttle bus to town, and whether in summer they could have parties outside in the adjacent field, or, if it were raining, then in the barn on top of the hill. No longer the centre of attention, Li Min found it difficult to follow all their conversation. Despite her time at Harvard, she wasn't familiar with much of it. Musicians and rock bands she hadn't heard of, talk about Major League Baseball, some of the slang they used. She started to feel she was moving to the outer fringes of this circle of Americans and didn't know how she could reinstate herself. After dinner, they all got up to return their trays, and Li Min found herself trailing behind the group, wondering where they were going and wishing that she was going there too. She had momentarily felt she had made good progress in following Deng's orders, but had also realized she was feeling lonely here. It pleased her, for personal reasons and not because of Deng, finally to meet some Western students socially. But now it seemed she would have to return to her room and spend another evening studying, with only the radio for company. Sally turned round and called to her.
We're all going to Luke's room. He has something he brought from back home. Want to come?
And it was then, in fact, that the ice was not just broken, but completely melted away. For the something turned out to be several bottles of tequila. No drinker, Li Min had never had it. In fact, she wasn't entirely sure what it was, though she knew it was alcoholic. But she told herself she was breaking her teetotal ways for the sake of Deng. So she licked the salt Sally laughingly put on the back of her hand, closed her eyes, and swigged, trying not to cough as the liquor went down. Then she bit the lime slice, a sour but effective antidote to the rawness of the spirit. As the burning sensation gradually subsided, she felt a warmth moving through her limbs, and she was suddenly very happy to be socializing with people who had nothing to do with the lab. One of the boys put some music on, and in a corner, the only other girl there besides Sally started dancing by herself.
"Do you like to dance, Li Min?"
asked the boy with the ponytail. The true answer was no, but she sensed that would sound churlish, even prim, the very traits that Westerners supposedly found in their Chinese counterparts. The bottle came round again, and this time she took a big hit of the tequila, which no longer seemed to burn her throat so much.
In China, there are many kinds of dancing, she said. Even old people like to dance where I come from.
Really?
said the boy, and Li Min nodded. She remembered in her village an old woman, thought to be crazy by the villagers, but actually, Li Min had concluded, suffering from dementia and the slight shakiness of Parkinson's disease in its early stages. On public holidays, the woman would appear in the little square where, long ago, the village's inhabitants had come each day to draw water from a communal tap. Suddenly, she would start dancing, to music only she was able to hear, moving in a kind of take one step then slide, take one step then shuffle series of movements. People would gather round, laughing at this semi-grotesque tableau, but they were kind at heart, and each time the old woman finished, they would applaud and she would smile. Suddenly, Li Min found herself describing these semi-ritualistic appearances by the old woman. Then, standing up, she began to demonstrate the bizarre dance. The ponytail boy laughed, Sally Washington laughed too, and Li Min grinned, happy in their company. Happier than she had been since leaving Harvard. Chapter 13. The next morning, Li Min woke up with a headache unlike any she had ever suffered before. No lab today, she decided right away. She would be lucky to get downstairs to the dining hall without being sick. She remembered dimly that after dancing she had enjoyed 3 more big glugs of tequila. Or was it 4? She couldn't be sure, nor could she be sure how she had got back to her room. Someone had escorted her, taking her by the arm. It had been Sally, she realized, who had somehow found her key and seen her safely into bed. How embarrassing, thought Li Min, suddenly mortified at her unprecedented behavior. She had never been drunk before. And the dancing, what was she thinking? How would she ever look Sally in the face again? The girl must think her a clown. She managed to take 2 paracetamol and got back into her bed. Gradually, her dizziness subsided, and she staggered to the loo, where she stared at her face in the mirror until the reflected image stopped moving. She returned to bed and must have fallen asleep, for she woke with a start to the sound of a quiet knock on the door. Who could it be? A Chinese student? There was another quiet knock, and Li Min decided to face the music and get it over with. "Come in," she cried weakly. The handle turned. The door opened with a push of a hand. Sally Washington's hand. She stood in the doorway, holding a tray from the dining hall and wearing a big smile. "A little bit under the weather, are we?" she said with a laugh, and came into the room, still bearing the tray. "I've brought you lunch," she said, and lowered the tray onto the bed while Li Min gingerly sat up. Sally had brought her a Coke, the old-fashioned kind, full of sugar, a bag of salt and vinegar crisps, and a packet of Haribo sweets. "You are very kind. I am sorry about last night," Li Min began to say. Sally cut her off. "Sorry? You were the star of the evening. You were hilarious." And she gave a little shuffle, imitating Li Min's own imitation of the old woman's dance. "I have to hand it to you, Li Min. You're not like the other Chinese here, that's for sure. Who'd have thought you'd be such a dark horse? Listen, if you feel up to it, come down to dinner with us. I'll save a seat for you." After this, they became friends. Good friends. Deng's instructions could hardly have been better fulfilled, thought Li Min, wishing he would show up and ask for a report on her progress. On second thoughts, she was glad he'd stayed away. Her friendship with Sally was a genuine one, and Deng's interest in it was increasingly unwelcome. It was then that she received a letter from a visiting scholar, someone named Judith Davidson. It seemed she was a friend of Louise Donovan, the nice woman Li Min had met at a party during her last days at Harvard. At first, she read the letter happily, pleased to think she might make another friend now. 2 in 1 week. Clearly, as the Americans like to say, when it rained, it poured. But then doubts crept in. Louise had wanted her to talk with a friend. Someone in Washington with good contacts were the words she had used. This, after Li Min had impetuously expressed her frustration at being ordered to move to Oxford. Deng had surprised her by making her leave within days, so she had decided against meeting Louise's friend. It seemed too risky so close to her departure. The last thing she needed now was the Americans trying to interfere with her move, not when she had already made it successfully. She decided to treat this new approach with the same caution. It was probably innocent enough. She doubted the letter writer had anything to do with Washington, D.C., or the American government. That would be a coincidence too far, in Li Min's opinion. But why complicate things for herself? She was slightly wary of anyone contacting her at Louise's behest, since they might have been told of Li Min's unhappiness about having to switch institutions. And she wasn't unhappy any longer. Her work was going well. There weren't as many people here engaged in the same kind of simulation creations as there were at Harvard, so much for Deng's original claims for the place, but there was a friendliness in the Oxford lab, and a lack of competitiveness that were distinctly pleasant after the hothouse atmosphere at Harvard. And the English seemed better at adapting to their comparative lack of funding, using ingenuity where the Americans fell back on vast reserves of money to get things done. So she wouldn't answer the letter from the Davidson woman, she decided, though she kept it in a drawer in the night table next to her bed. She felt a little rude and was uneasy about her failure to respond, but told herself that if she ever met the woman, she could always claim she had never received the message. In any case, and not because of Deng, she had made a real friend in Sally. Li Min was confident that she was really Sally's friend, since for all her easygoing party-girl antics, Sally Washington was showing signs of being a very private person who rarely talked about herself. Disclosures from her were rare and usually guarded, which somehow seemed more English than American. One evening, as they sat outside together, Li Min realized she was truly accepted by Sally when the girl suddenly said,
"You know I'm half Chinese, right?"
"Really?" said Li Min, who knew full well that Sally's mother was a native of Langfang, a small city near Beijing.
"Yes, but it's so embarrassing that I don't speak Mandarin, or Cantonese for that matter. My mother's been in America for 30 years and doesn't want anything to do with her old country. She wouldn't let me learn anything about it either, including the language."
"Why does she feel like that?"
"I guess once she met my father, she decided to become as American as possible. I know she was worried that her being Chinese might hurt his career."
Li Min was intrigued by this, but tried hard not to show it.
"What does he do?" she asked casually. "He works at the Defense Department. That's why I'm from Washington. Don't ask me any more. All I know is he has something to do with submarines. It's all very hush-hush. He never talks about his job. I know sometimes he goes away and is actually on a submarine. I could never do that. Far too claustrophobic for me."
"Me too," said Li Min, who in fact feared heights rather than enclosed spaces.
"Maybe he talks to your mom about it?"
Sally shrugged.
"Who knows? She'd never tell me if he did."
Chapter 14.
"Dinner is served,"
the man in the butler's uniform announced.
"Will you excuse me?"
asked Charles Abbott.
"I'd better collect my guest before he disappears in the scrum."
"Of course," said Manon, and the woman next to her, an English don from another college, nodded. They were standing with other diners in the senior common room, where they'd drunk sherry for the last quarter of an hour. Abbott had made a beeline for Manon as soon as she had entered, which she'd found kind and supportive, even if he had brought her over to meet the English don, who had shown little interest in the Library of Congress, asserting petulantly,
"I dislike libraries, stuffy places."
They moved into the hall, a beautiful old room with a beamed ceiling and oak-panelled walls, on which hung portraits of each principal since the college's founding 7 centuries before. Now the room was packed with undergraduates, waiting noisily for their food as the high-table diners came through to sit on an elevated dais at the end of the room. They all stood for a moment while a fellow said grace, Christum Dominum Nostrum, then sat down to be served by waiting staff dressed in black and white. The noise level in the hall rose and fell as speech gradually became replaced by the furious clatter of forks and knives. At the high table itself, dinner unfolded more leisurely, as a starter of smoked salmon was served with a delicate Riesling. As promised, Manon had been placed next to Professor Arthur Cole. She saw this from the name card at his place to her left. He nodded to her as they both sat down, but then turned to speak to his neighbour on the other side.
"Hello,"
said a voice to her right, and she turned to a bulky, red-faced man who gave her a grin. This must be McCaffrey, the history don Abbott had mentioned, and it was. He introduced himself, speaking with an almost theatrically thick Scottish burr. As they ate the salmon, McCaffrey kept talking.
"Have you met the principal yet?"
No, she said. Just the director of the institute.
"Ah, Charles. Nice man. Seems very capable as well. A rare combination, especially at a university. As for the principal, you may just manage to catch a fleeting glimpse of him. Funny thing, his predecessor made a point of meeting everyone who visited us, whether it was for 3 days or 3 years. Sometimes he even greeted the occasional tourist who was just walking around."
McCaffrey took a long sip of his wine.
"The present principal employs a different strategy, if you can call it that. We see less and less of him at high table. At this rate, his next appearance at dinner will coincide with the announcement of his retirement."
When he laughed, Manon did too, though less loudly. Like anyone else, she enjoyed indiscretions, especially comic ones, imparted in moments of humorous candour, but now she felt glad she was not, at least as yet, an enemy of McCaffrey's. He turned to his other side, where a woman had been sitting silently. Deserted, Manon sat overlooked for a few minutes, staring awkwardly across the table at the portraits on the back wall, until at last Cole turned to her once more and said,
"I'm told you are Miss Davidson, and that you are a librarian visiting the Institute from America."
That's right,
she said. It seemed gratuitous to reciprocate by asking who he was, since clearly he assumed she knew.
"We've never had a librarian at the Institute before, that I can remember,"
he said, not entirely affably.
"We've never felt the need for one. I set up the Institute, you know."
Bully for you, thought Manon, unable to look impressed. Cole speared some salmon and examined it, then went on.
"Which library are you from?"
none at present. I was at the Library of Congress for a while,
she replied.
Not an academic library, then?"
Manon did not think it worth replying to this put-down, and took a sip of her Riesling before changing the subject. She didn't want to be pressed on her credentials, aiming to make herself appear naive, almost simple, in her view of the world. The less sophisticated the better, she decided, since she imagined this would elicit more unguarded opinions from Cole than any battle of wits between them would. She said innocently,
"One thing has surprised me, and that's the number of Chinese students in the college."
"Oh," he said dully, as if to imply, "So what?"
"It did make me wonder, do they have trouble adjusting to life here?"
"No more than other foreign students."
He sounded defensive.
"But our ways are so different, at least from what I gather about Chinese Moors,"
he said sharply.
"Then I would urge you to gather their mores some more."
This was rude enough for even Cole to realize it. He said more mildly but expansively,
"You see, the Chinese are almost infinitely adaptable. It is one of the great strengths of their culture, and the advantage of being the oldest nation on earth. They have literally seen it all."
"I understand. I suppose I was thinking of the prejudice they must encounter in the West. In America, for example, anti-Chinese sentiment seems to be growing.
America is a lost cause,
Cole said sharply.
I remain more hopeful about my own country, and certainly the impact of the Chinese here is for the good, even to the level of this dinner. We are much more international now, and have a wider variety of guests, much more distinguished, generally speaking. It may seem comparatively insignificant, but I can't tell you the effect it's had on morale. The positive effect,
he said vehemently, in case she somehow got the wrong end of the stick.
But can the UK really adopt a different policy towards China from the US? I take it that's what you mean.
We can stay clear of your country's madness, yes. The Chinese have so much to offer, it would be a tragedy if we joined with the forces of ignorance and shut our doors to them.
To Manon, Cole sounded like an arch-appeaser circa 1936, arguing that Germany would see the sense of peace if only warmongers in the UK did not unnecessarily provoke them. But she was not there to argue with the man, so merely nodded, trying to look thoughtful, though nonetheless unwilling to agree with him outright. Cole didn't seem to care much either way. She sensed that in his view she was just another mindless American, and a woman to boot. As the main course of beef was served and the claret poured, Cole turned again to his left, and soon, moments later, she heard him starting to tell his other neighbour at the table about his collection of Chinese ceramics. Not such a good start there, thought Manon. But Abbott had warned her. Chapter 15. Someone had been in her room. Li Min could not say exactly how she knew this, but she was certain. She sniffed several times. There was a faint, unpleasant smell that had not been there before. Sally had been in the room several times since the tequila debacle. Her scent was of soap and the open air, and there was no possible reason for her to have been searching Li Min's room. This smell was sour and dank. The odour of a sweaty men's locker room. Moreover, items had been moved. Li Min was sure of it. The books on her desk were in the same small stack, but too tidily so, too neatly aligned. The same for the pile of folders. She was not, by nature, particularly messy, but whoever had been in here clearly had higher standards of tidiness. Who could it be? And how did they get in? Could it be that mean-looking woman, Pierpont? She would have a key. But why would she want to rifle through Li Min's room? What could she suspect? That she was a spy for the Chinese government. Deng's silence since their meeting in the cemetery didn't mean he'd gone away, or that he wouldn't pop up at any time now and demand to know what progress she had made in getting to know Sally Washington. But he wouldn't have been searching her room, she was sure of that. She realized, with growing dismay, that her friendship with Sally would never be entirely real, however much she wanted it to be. It would always be tainted by her subordination to Deng and to their government, and by their instructions to her to get close to the American girl. Her thoughts circled back uneasily to her conviction that someone had been through her things. Could it be the Western authorities had suspected her? There had been an unpleasant incident at Harvard in one of the molecular biology labs where agents from the FBI had come in and taken away a Chinese student in handcuffs. That had been in the previous year. The last she'd heard of him was that he was being held in a federal prison, waiting to come to trial. A frisson of fear ran through her at the thought that perhaps she was suspected. The woman Pierpont downstairs in the office always acted as if she had done something wrong and had never been friendly. And what if even Sally was working for the Chinese government? That would explain why she had let Li Min make friends with her so easily. Whoever it was, she wondered if they would come back. She needed to take steps to identify the intruder, and opening her laptop, she went onto Amazon, joined Prime with its promise of next-day delivery, and found a bewildering range of kit to choose from. Eventually, she found exactly what she needed. But Amazon scared her slightly, since her purchases could be easily traced. So, late the following afternoon, she took the shuttle bus, got off on Botley Road, and went into a hardware shop. She bought the tools she was after, and that evening skipped dinner downstairs, making do with a sandwich she'd bought from Tesco. By midnight, she'd finished the installation. 3 days later, returning to her room from a day spent in the lab, she felt certain that someone had been in again. There was no smell this time, just a sense of recent disturbance in the usually stuffy atmosphere of the small living space. She booted up her laptop, then synced it to the camera she had carefully positioned between the books on her bookcase, nowhere near the ceiling, as a suspicious person would immediately check there for surveillance. She scrolled rapidly through the feed recorded that day, but nothing changed in the captured images for the first 5 hours after her morning departure. Then, at 3:15, the door must have opened, though it was out of camera range, and seconds later, the image of a tall, well-built man passed by the camera lens. Li Min had turned on the audio capture and listened as the drawers of her dresser were pulled open, though at one point the man paused, as if he had found something of interest. Then he was visible again, going through her clothes in the wardrobe, feeling every inch of fabric for anything secreted there. He turned next to her bed, even checking under the mattress and inside the pillowcases. Finally, the bathroom, where she could hear him pulling back the shower curtain and rattling the mug she used to hold her toothbrush and throwaway razor. When she heard the door close at last, Li Min exhaled. She'd been holding her breath while she watched what had taken place in her room 4 hours earlier. She was still shocked by what she'd seen. She felt violated, stripped of her dignity and privacy. She would have been absolutely furious had not she felt so numb, especially when she saw who had done the violating. It was not the local authorities who were spying on her, not Nina Pierpont or the Fellows of St. Felix's or the British police. It was one of her own countrymen. But what exactly was Mr. Chu looking for? Almost simultaneously, she thought of the letter she had received from Judith Davidson. It was in the drawer of her night table. He must have read it. But after all, there was nothing incriminating about it. Defiantly, for reasons she couldn't really explain to herself, she decided she would answer it, and right away. Chapter 16. Charles Abbott wanted to help Manon, but he didn't know how. He had not seen her since he'd watched her from afar at High Table, where she'd seemed to be at ease with McCaffrey on one side and holding her own with Arthur Cole on the other. He'd hoped that after dessert she would stay on for coffee and they could exchange a few words, but she had left once the port had gone round twice. He had noticed she was not much of a drinker. Judith Davidson. How he wished he could get to know her better, but in the circumstances, that would be difficult. He liked her and told himself there was nothing wrong with that. Gillian, too, would have liked this woman. His wife had been highly resourceful, and in fact played a small part in an operation Delaney had been conducting in one of the countries where they had all been posted. He was sure Gillian would have wanted him to be friendly, as well as helping Manon as much as he could. Who are you kidding? He asked himself. He recognized that he was lonely. He missed female company and had liked Manon from the moment he'd met her. But since she was involved in an espionage investigation, he realized that he must stand back. His seeing too much of her might jeopardize her impersonation of Judith Davidson. She seemed focused on finding out why Li Min was here, and there was nothing useful he could contribute to that. Jia Hao, however, was now thousands of miles away. His letter alone was hardly enough evidence for anyone to act on. Except perhaps for its mention of the mysterious Mr. Chu. Abbott had looked him up in the Elms Directory of Students and realized he had seen him in college. How could you miss him? He was enormous. 6'6" at least, and heavily built. He must weigh 18 stone, and none of it seemed to be fat. Young Mr. Chew stood out. He would have done so anywhere, except perhaps in the scrum of the Oxford rugby team. It was hard to picture him with his head in his books, being genuinely interested in, say, the reign of Richard II. The guy seemed better suited to life as a hired thug, and certainly looked the part. Abbott had never seen him smile. He looked up Chew's file. He was reading for an M.Lit and was in his second year. He would have had to submit an extensive sample of written work at the end of the first year, and Abbott looked that up as well, curious to find out what topic he had chosen. To his surprise, he saw that Chew hadn't submitted anything. Technically, therefore, he remained a probationary student and had been granted a deferral of 2 terms before submitting any written work. Looking further back, he saw that Chew had been ill with some unspecified ailment. There was a doctor's note supporting his application for a postponement, but when Abbott looked at the scanned document, he saw it didn't come from a local surgery, but from a doctor attached to the Chinese embassy in London. Was that really acceptable? It shouldn't have been in Abbott's view. Also in the file, there was a brief note from Arthur Cole, simply stating that he supported granting a deferral. He didn't say why, seeming to assume a simple endorsement from him would suffice. And finally, Chew's supervisor, Ian McCaffrey, had written at some length in his support, citing the calibre of his research and expressing confidence that once his health had been restored, he would submit written work of high quality. McCaffrey was nobody's fool, and certainly not inclined to favour the Chinese, so Abbott's scepticism eased a bit. Until he looked further at the file. There were seminars held each week for first-year graduate students throughout the year. Attendance was mandatory. No formal marks were assigned for student contributions in the seminars, just a note from the chairman of faculty, someone named Bailey, confirming attendance. In Chew's case, however, there was no such confirmation, only a note in green ink that read, N.A. Not applicable? Or no attendance? Abbott wanted to find out. Weird. It all seemed weird. A Chinese student studying medieval England was unusual enough, though that was no justification for outright suspicion. Failure to submit written work was serious, especially if explained on the grounds of illness, when the student was up and about and more than healthy-looking. The more Abbott pondered this, the more he wondered about Chew's academic attainments and true reason for being in Oxford. At lunch, he made a point of timing his departure to coincide with Ian McCaffrey's. He didn't know the man well. Who did he know well in college? But he had been among the friendlier of the dons when Abbott had arrived. McCaffrey was wearing a green tweed jacket and a jolly red tie. He turned as Abbott followed him out of the SCR.
I like that young lassie you have visiting. She's good fun. I hear she's a high-powered librarian. What's she here to do? I met her at a conference in the States. She's actually on a sabbatical in Britain, but she's agreed to spend time helping me sort out the papers connected with the founding of the Institute and other things. Currently, they're in a frightful mess, and nobody knows where anything is. You old rogue! How did you persuade her to do that?
Abbott tried not to show irritation at this and merely said,
She was eager to spend some time in an Oxford college. Pity she's not staying longer. I had an extremely invigorating time with her at the guest night dinner last week, all thanks to Arthur Cole, rude old sod. He had his back turned to her for 2 courses. I felt it only polite to fill the gap for our new arrival.
McCaffrey said with a smile, then frowned.
I hope Cole's not making your job a misery. I don't see much of him. Ah, good. Best to leave him to his pots. A resident sinophile.
They were in the quad now, walking past the flower boxes, which now held tulips starting to open in the spring sun. Abbott said casually,
Speaking of the Chinese, I had a question. For me? Go ahead. You're supervising a student from China, a Mr. Chu. That's right,
said McCaffrey. He seemed amused.
I was intrigued. Are there many Chinese students of English medieval history? Not that I know of,
said McCaffrey.
It takes all kinds, I guess. I noticed he didn't submit work for the graduate transfer. No,
said McCaffrey, who suddenly seemed more alert.
He was ill. I see. Is he better now? Decidedly so. Have you seen the man? He's a great big bruiser and a picture of health, I'd say. He got an extension, yes? He did. Arthur and I wrote on his behalf. That seemed to do the trick. Do you think he'll take his degree?
McCaffrey stopped walking.
I can't swear to it, of course, but I retain a resolute optimism.
When Abbott looked him searchingly in the eye, he shrugged, like a small boy caught taking change from his mother's purse.
Resolute, but possibly not realistic. Look,
he said a little impatiently.
Your scepticism is not unwarranted, but consider things from my point of view. The Chinese offered to pay for 2 full scholarships for graduate medieval studies, and I mean full, from day 1 of the MA all the way through the DPhil. This, moreover, in a field in which the Chinese are not conceivably planning to specialise, or from which they will learn much of value in their sea-run society. And all they suggested in return, and I stress it was suggested, not demanded, was that we look favourably on the application of young Mr. Chu, who, I need not remind you, is paying the full whack of our extortionate fees for foreign graduate students. Will he get a degree, you ask? Sure, and fish will fly out of the bottling. But you know what they say about gift horses. Yes,
said Abbott, impressed by McCaffrey's candour, but not entirely surprised.
They say that even when they added the pair of wings, Pegasus never got off the ground.
Chapter 17. There was something he didn't like about this new visitor to the Institute, Judith Davidson. Never keen on Americans, and not at his happiest in the company of women, Arthur Cole had found a double dose of antipathy difficult to stomach. He had tried to be polite, but inwardly cursed the seating plan that had put her next to him at high table. She'd spouted the usual claptrap about the Chinese, but it was puzzling to him why she'd chosen China as the main topic of their admittedly limited conversation. She had once been a government librarian, so what was this all about? Well, she would be gone before too long, so best to keep his distance in the meantime. She had seemed too interested by half in the Chinese portion of the student body, and doubtless would in time turn her attention to the Institute. And there were certain aspects, now historical, of the funding of the Institute he was not keen to be widely known. Abbott, as director, might discover most of them in time, but he was self-confessedly bad with finance, and the Institute's accountant was a retired bookkeeper named Hills, who worked part-time, never rocked the boat, and still came to Cole if anything tricky arose. He got up and stood by his window overlooking the main quad of the college. He was dressed in a Harris tweed jacket, a sleeveless jumper, flannel trousers, and a bow tie. By his standards, this was casual, but he liked the warmth. He thought about how best to spend this last part of the day, and was considering a visit to the college library, where soon an exhibition of his best pieces would go on display, when there was a knock on his door. 3 sharp knocks, in fact, which irritated him. He thought fleetingly of ignoring the interruption, but told himself that whoever was there would just come back at an even less convenient time.
"Come in,"
he called out crossly. The door opened, and Cole was confronted by an enormous man, tall and broad and quite frightening as he stood looming in the doorway. Then he recognized the figure. It was the Chinese student Chu, known in college as Mr. Chu for reasons Cole neither knew nor cared about. To him, Chu was a student, and thus, in Cole's old-fashioned way, didn't warrant the prefix Mr.
"Ah, Chu," he said,
relaxed now that this monster-sized man turned out to be familiar.
"Were you wishing to see me?"
Please,
said Chu simply. Cole remembered from their first meeting that Chu's English was not his forte. Put frankly, it was substandard for someone supposedly doing graduate work in a field where language expertise was required. How did McCaffrey cope with him, Cole wondered.
"Come in,"
he said, and Chu slowly entered. Cole pointed to one of the two armchairs and sat in the other one. As Chu sat down, the chair seemed to disappear under his bulk, leaving only the arms visible.
"Now, what is the problem?"
asked Cole, enunciating each word carefully.
"Is it about your extension? I understand that it's been granted."
not that,
said Chu.
"What else, then? Are you having trouble with the sample of your work? Dr. McCaffrey hasn't said anything to me."
My work is fine,
said Chu curtly, which Cole was pretty sure was a great big fib. Chu went on.
I am assigned by the embassy to do a task.
"Oh? What is that?"
They have instructed me to look after a new student who has come from Harvard.
"Is that Li Min?"
Cole had only met her once, quite briefly, here in his room. She'd seemed competent enough, and doubtless intelligent, but he was surprised by the fuss made of her by the resident computer scientist. There had seemed nothing obviously extraordinary about the diminutive young woman he had spoken with in Mandarin, though her English, when she insisted on switching to it, had turned out to be flawless.
Correct.
"I'm sure she will be grateful for any help you can give her. It can be very lonely for some students here."
Maybe,
said Chu, pronouncing both syllables with equal stress.
But I am concerned.
"Why?"
She is not communicating so much with other Chinese students, and lately she has received a proposal to meet from someone we are not sure is a suitable acquaintance.
"Who is that?" asked Cole. This was sounding increasingly peculiar.
A visitor named Davidson.
"The American librarian," Cole said. "She knows Li Min."
She wants to know Li Min,
amended Chu.
"How do you know this?"
She wrote a letter.
"And Li Min showed you it?" asked Cole, genuinely curious.
I have seen the letter.
Cole understood at once. Chu had seen the letter without Li Min's permission. The man had been snooping. Ordinarily, Cole would have been furious and would have reprimanded any student for looking through the personal belongings of a peer. Not at all the way to behave. But the Chinese were different. Their government took pains to protect their young people here with methods the West would not tolerate and did not understand. But Cole could and did understand them. The officials of the People's Republic had perfectly natural worries that their students would fall prey to Western influences that no one, certainly not Cole, could seriously defend. Sexual misconduct, drug-taking, rap. Cole wasn't sure which was the worst, so he disapproved of them all equally. And if in defending their students from these things the Chinese officials overstepped the mark in Western eyes, so be it. Compared to Chinese generosity, the strength of their ancient culture, These infractions were mere bagatelles, ones Cole was happy to ignore. So he didn't press Chu on how he had come to see this letter. Unfortunately, Chu was equally unforthcoming when Cole asked him why he thought Miss Davidson posed any kind of threat. It was as if the mere act of writing to a Chinese girl was anathema, or perhaps it was that Li Min had been singled out for special protection by the Chinese embassy in London. If that were the case, Cole didn't understand why, but decided he did not need to find out. Where he could help, he supposed, was in exploring the bona fides of Miss Davidson. In which case, he had better put aside his mild animus, he decided as Chu left, and get to know the woman. Chapter 18. Back from London, where she had reported to Saunders on her admitted lack of progress, Manon stopped in the porter's lodge to collect her post. There was one sealed envelope which she opened, standing in the lodge out of the sun. She saw at once it was from Li Min, and read,
Dear Judith, thank you for your note. It would be very nice to meet. Would you be free later this week? Perhaps Thursday towards the end of the day? 6 o'clock? I could meet you at the Varsity Club in the covered market. I am told it has excellent views from the terrace at the top. Let me know, please, and I look forward to meeting you then. Yours sincerely, Li Min.
Bingo, thought Manon, carefully putting the letter back into its envelope and then her bag. Li Min had given her email address, which Manon replied to, saying yes to the invitation. On Thursday morning, she did a recce of the covered market, and after fruitless searching of the shops and stalls, at last found the entrance to the Varsity Club tucked away in one of the little alleys leading to the adjacent high street. Despite its name, the Varsity was clearly not a members' club, but a cocktail bar. On Thursday afternoon, Charles Abbott was still in London, and Manon spent the afternoon at home in North Oxford, enjoying the summery warmth that a high-pressure front had brought to the UK. There was a shed at the end of the little garden behind her flat, and she found a deck chair in it that she opened up and set down on the patio outside the kitchen. Sitting there in the sun, with her work notebook and a pen in her hand, she thought about the previous occasion she had worked in Oxford. On that occasion, too, she had been required to recruit an agent, a Russian girl. The operation had been successful, and considering that at the time she'd had no training, remarkably successful. She hadn't suffered from nerves then because she had no experience of an operation going wrong. In fact, she had had no prior experience at all. Now, things were different. Would she be as successful this time, she wondered. Let's hope so, she thought. But she couldn't help feeling nervous. All the preparation only made her more aware of the possibility of failure. Saunders was right in thinking that Li Min was a contact worth developing. Why would she have come here on her government's orders unless it were to do something for that government? Or, more likely, find out something. Her masters were ruthless. This Manon knew. They would not have ordered Li Min here because it was good for her health. What could it be, then, Manon wondered. Presumably something to do with deep fakes, since that was Li Min's area of expertise. But what were they faking? Would it involve a specific individual? A person the Chinese would use as the object of their fakery? Who could that be? It was hard to imagine a target of value among the students at St. Felix's or its institute. And what use to the People's Republic would one of the fellows be? Only Li Min would know who was involved, which meant she was the one Manon must focus on, especially since the only other source, Chia Hao, was now somewhere back in China, presumably unwillingly returned and unreachable. She remembered the point made by one of the instructors, who had been schooling her group in the intricacies of agent recruitment. He had explained that there was no detailed guide on how to recruit and run an agent. To a great extent, it depended on instinct and natural curiosity. He'd said,
"You want to know what the target knows, but to find that out, you need to establish a personal relationship. You need to make them like you and trust you, and to do that, you need to care about them."
Manon didn't have the faintest idea what Li Min was like or could be up to, but she was determined to find out. Chapter 19. As term proceeded, Li Min noticed that her fellow students in the lab, initially so friendly, were starting to avoid her. She thought at first that this was because she was new to the lab, and the first year's postgraduates had already made their friends. But as term went on, she realized that her fellow first years were avoiding her too. At the college drinks party for students, including the Institute's new arrivals that year, she had found herself alone for much of the time, though the Institute director Charles Abbott had noticed this and brought her over to meet a few of the fellows. Despite this, the students seemed happy to keep their distance. Li Min wondered if it had something to do with her being Chinese, since there was more than enough suspicion of her country in the West these days. But whatever initial prejudice she had encountered in the past, she had always overcome it. She had a friendly, open manner, spoke excellent English, and, perhaps most important of all, never showed undue interest in other people's work or asked too many questions. Once, at a party in Harvard, a grad student had told her, after he'd had one too many beers, that no one could ever think she was a spy for the Chinese government, since she wasn't interested at all in what her fellow students were doing. Though she was always willing to help her fellow students if they asked her, it was true that Li Min was very caught up in her own projects, and gradually she understood that it was her work that was distancing her from her peers. It had begun with the audio simulation, and the trigger had been Alicia, the girl who had read for Li Min but then objected so strenuously when she listened to the simulated result. What had upset her so much? Li Min really couldn't understand it. Alicia's fright at hearing